In 1993, archaeologists sent a robot into a tunnel inside the Great Pyramid, a passage so narrow no human being had ever entered it, and after climbing 200 feet through solid stone, its camera lit up something that should not exist. A door. A slab of polished white limestone, cut to fit the shaft perfectly, sealed in place 4,500 years ago. And mounted on the face of that door were two copper pins, green with age, worked by human hands at the dawn of recorded history. Someone built a hidden passage through millions of tons of rock, aimed it with astonishing precision, and then sealed it shut with a stone door no one was ever supposed to find. That is the shocking secret the robot revealed. But it was only the first one, because 9 years later, a second robot went back, drilled through that door on live television in front of tens of millions of people, pushed a camera through the hole, and found another door standing right behind the first. Two sealed barriers, one behind the other, guarding the dead end of a shaft that leads nowhere. And that was still not the end of it. In the years that followed, machines kept going back into the Great Pyramid, and every single time, they came out with something stranger. Hidden writing, sealed in darkness for millennia, copper fittings decorated on a side no living eye was ever meant to see. And finally, a discovery so large it made headlines around the world. A hollow space the size of an airliner, floating in the stone core of the pyramid, with no entrance, no exit, and no explanation. Stay with me, because this is a story about 3 discoveries, each one stranger than the last, and the final chapter is unfolding right now. Egypt's most famous archaeologist has announced that a sealed corridor inside the pyramid ends at a door that has never been opened, and that the answer may finally come this year. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to where it all started. A shaft, 8 inches wide, and a question that refused to die. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built for the pharaoh Khufu around 2500 BCE, 480 feet tall, roughly 2.5 million blocks of stone. It stayed the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, and it is the most studied building in human history. And yet, no one has ever fully mapped what is inside it. Most people picture a solid mountain of rock with one burial chamber in the middle. The reality is stranger. There are 3 known rooms. An unfinished chamber cut into the bedrock far below the base. A room in the core that scholars call the Queen's Chamber, though no queen was ever buried there. And higher up, the King's Chamber, a room of red granite where Khufu was supposedly laid to rest. Connecting them is the Grand Gallery, a soaring corridor with a corbelled ceiling that climbs like the inside of a cathedral. But here is the detail that started everything. Running out from both the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber are narrow shafts, about 8 inches by 8 inches, far too small for any person to enter. The 2 shafts from the King's Chamber punch all the way through the pyramid and open to the sky. So for over a century, the explanation was simple. Air shafts, ventilation, a way for the building or the dead king's spirit to breathe. And then someone looked closely at the shafts from the Queen's Chamber, and the theory fell apart. Because the Queen's Chamber shafts do not reach the outside, they start inside the pyramid, climb up through the stone at a steep angle, and stop. Dead ends, sealed inside solid rock. A ventilation shaft that never reaches air ventilates nothing. So what were they for? Why would ancient builders cut 2 perfect channels through a man-made mountain and then hide the openings behind the chamber walls, plastered over, where no one would ever see them? It gets worse. These shafts were not cut carelessly. They were aimed. Researchers who measured their angles found that the shafts point towards specific stars as they would have appeared over Giza around the time of construction. The southern shaft of the King's Chamber lines up with the Belt of Orion, the constellation the Egyptians tied to Osiris, their god of the afterlife and rebirth. The northern shaft points toward the circumpolar stars, the ones that never set, which the Egyptians called the imperishable ones. These are not vents. They are precision channels driven through millions of tons of stone aimed at the heavens. And two of them lead nowhere at all. For more than 100 years, no one could look inside. A grown man could not fit an arm past the first few feet. The mystery just sat there, acknowledged by everyone, solved by no one, until a German engineer decided that if a human could not go in, a machine could. His name was Rudolf Gantenbrink. He was a robotics engineer, not an archaeologist, and in the early 1990s, he was working under the German Archaeological Institute on a completely ordinary problem. The pyramid was packed with tourists. The air inside was humid and stale, and someone suggested the old king's chamber shafts might be fitted with fans to improve airflow. Gantenbrink built a small tracked robot to crawl inside and inspect them. He named it Upuaut, after an ancient Egyptian god whose name means the opener of the ways. He had no idea how fitting that name would become. The king's chamber shafts checked out. They ran through to daylight exactly as expected. But then Gantenbrink turned his robot toward the real mystery, the sealed shafts of the Queen's chamber, the ones that led nowhere. In March of 1993, the robot entered the southern shaft and began to climb. The passage rose at nearly 40 degrees, forcing the little machine to press against the walls as it went. It crawled past kinks and steps in the stone that would have trapped a cruder design. 60 feet, 100 feet, 150, and then roughly 200 feet in, about 63 meters into the solid heart of the pyramid, its headlights hit a wall. But it was not the rough end of an abandoned tunnel. It was a slab, smooth, flat, deliberately cut from fine white Tura limestone, the premium stone the Egyptians reserved for their most important surfaces. It sealed the shaft from wall to wall, fitted with care. This was not where the builders gave up and quit. This was a door. And then the camera saw the pins. Two small fittings of copper mounted on the face of the stone, spaced apart like handles. One broken off, the other bent and worn. Nothing like them exists anywhere else in the pyramid. Copper was valuable in Khufu's Egypt. You do not decorate a hidden slab 200 feet inside a wall, at the end of a shaft no human could ever crawl through, with two carefully worked pieces of metal, unless that door meant something. The footage went out to the world and detonated. Newspapers called it Gantenbrink's door. A sealed barrier deep inside the Great Pyramid, in a place no one knew existed, marked with metal and buried behind millions of tons of stone. The question wrote itself. What were the Egyptians hiding behind it? And here is where it gets strange, because the door was not the first impossible thing pulled out of these shafts. Back in 1872, an engineer named Wayneman Dixon had discovered the hidden openings of the Queen's chamber shafts by tapping the walls and breaking through the plaster that concealed them. He reached in as far as a human arm could go, and he pulled out three objects: a small ball of dark stone, a double hook of bronze or copper, and a fragment of cedar wood. Three relics, small enough to hold in one hand, left inside a sealed shaft in the heart of the pyramid by the people who built it. The ball and the hook ended up in the British Museum. The wood vanished for over a century. Then, in 2020, it was rediscovered, misfiled inside a cigar box in a university collection in Aberdeen, Scotland. And when scientists finally carbon dated it, the result made the mystery worse, not better. The wood dated to between 3,300 and 41 and 3,094 BCE. That is centuries older than the pyramid itself. The builders sealed a piece of wood inside the shaft that was already ancient when they placed it there. Whether it was a treasured heirloom, a tool made from old timber, or something ritual, nobody knows. Every time investigators reach into these shafts, they come back with another small impossibility, and never with an answer. Gantenbrink wanted answers. He tried the northern shaft, the twin passage on the other side of the chamber, but his robot hit a sharp bend, and he could not risk losing it in the stone forever. he pulled back, and then the project collapsed. There were disputes over authority, over how the discovery had reached the press, over control of the footage. The robot came out of the pyramid, the door stayed closed, and for 9 years, the most tantalizing discovery inside the most famous building on Earth simply sat there in the dark, found, filmed, and abandoned. But some questions do not go away. In September of 2002, the door got its second visitor, and this time, the whole planet was watching. A new machine, the Pyramid Rover, built by an American robotics company and backed by National Geographic, climbed the same southern shaft in a live broadcast beamed to tens of millions of people around the world. It reached Gantenbrink's door, and then it did something no one had ever done. It drilled. A slim bit pushed a small hole through the 4,500-year-old limestone, and the engineers threaded a fiber optic camera through the opening, into a darkness that had been sealed since the pyramid was raised. Millions of people leaned toward their screens in the middle of the night, waiting to see what a pharaoh had hidden at the dawn of history. The camera pushed through, and there, just inches beyond the first door, it found a second door. Another slab of stone, blocking the way again. No chamber, no coffin, no treasure. A small gap, and then a second sealed barrier standing directly behind the first. The broadcast ended on an anticlimax that only deepened the mystery, because the question it left behind was worse than the one it answered. Why would you build one hidden door and then build a second hidden door right behind it? What are you protecting when one seal is not enough? And before the mission ended, the Pyramid Rover did one more thing that almost nobody talks about. It climbed the northern shaft the one Gantenbrink had been forced to abandon, navigating its bends for the first time in history. And at almost exactly the same distance into the stone, its camera found the same thing. Another limestone door, with another pair of copper pins, not similar, not inspired by it, the same. 2 shafts on opposite sides of the chamber, each sealed at the same depth by matching doors with matching metal fittings. That is not an accident. That is not a builder running out of stone. That is a design, executed twice, with intent. Whatever these doors are, the architects of the Great Pyramid wanted 2 of them placed with mirror precision inside a monument of 2.5 million blocks. If you're the kind of person who needs to know what's behind that second door, hit subscribe, because this investigation is exactly what this channel does every single week. Now we get to the mission that finally read what was written in the dark, because Egypt was not satisfied, and in 2011, a new international team arrived with a machine unlike anything that had entered the pyramid before. They named their robot Djedi, after the magician that ancient texts say Khufu himself consulted when planning the layout of his pyramid. The name was a signal. This time, they intended to uncover the plan itself. Djedi carried what its engineers called a micro-snake camera, a tiny lens on a flexible arm that could pass through the hole drilled in 2002 and then bend, curling around to look sideways, upward, downward, and backward. For the first time, a machine inside that shaft could see the hidden faces of things. It could look at the back of the door it had just passed through. And when it did, it found 2 things that changed the entire conversation. The first was the copper pins. For nearly 20 years, people had argued about them. Some said handles, some said symbolic keys. Fringe theorists insisted they were electrical terminals, proof that the pyramid was an ancient power plant. No one had ever seen the far side of them. Djedi's camera curled around, and there was the truth. On the hidden side of the door, the pins were bent into small, neat, deliberate loops. Carefully finished curls of copper, shaped by a craftsman on a surface he knew would be sealed in total darkness forever. That is not wiring, that is not machinery, that is ornament. And you do not decorate the invisible unless the object itself is sacred or ceremonial or meant for eyes that are not human. The back of the door was polished too. Smooth, finished. Not the rough face of a plug jammed in to fill a hole, but a worked surface, treated with the same care as the front. Both sides of this door mattered to the people who made it, even though one side would never be seen by anyone, ever. But it was the second discovery that stopped everyone cold. When Djedi angled its camera down toward the floor of the tiny space between the doors, the light caught markings, painted in red ochre, lines and figures drawn by a human hand and sealed away, untouched and unread, for 4,500 years. A message from one of the men who built the Great Pyramid, left in a place he believed no one would ever look again. For a moment, it seemed like the pyramid was finally speaking. Secret writing behind a sealed door at the dead end of an impossible shaft. The last human to see those marks was the man who painted them, standing in that shaft while the pyramid was still rising around him. And this is where the wild theories and the hard evidence collide. So let me be honest with you about what those marks actually say. The dramatic reading is obvious. Hidden hieroglyphs, a message for the gods. Parts of the internet ran with exactly that. But the specialists who analyzed the images came back with something quieter, and in its own way, more astonishing. The red marks matched the system of figures Egyptian work crews used on construction sites. And the leading interpretation, published in 2013, reads them as a number. 121. 121. Measured in the ancient Egyptian cubit, that number is almost exactly the length of the shaft itself. The mark on that hidden floor appears to be a builder's measurement. The length of the tunnel, recorded by the crew that cut it, sealed inside the stone the moment the door went in. Think about what that means. The shaft was not a mistake or an afterthought. It was measured, recorded, and closed according to plan. The builders knew its length to the cubit. They wrote it down. Then they sealed it behind a finely cut limestone door, decorated with looped copper on a face no one would see, polished on both sides, with a second door behind the first. Every detail deliberate, which only sharpens the question that will not die. If this was just a construction shaft, why the ceremonial door? Why the copper? Why? Two of them. You do not seal a ruler mark behind matching pairs of ornamental stone barriers on both sides of a chamber. Now, before we go further, let me slow down, because this is where a serious investigation separates itself from fantasy. Does any of this prove there is a treasure chamber, a hidden tomb, or a lost archive behind those doors? Probably not. There is no evidence of that, and the physical clues point somewhere more grounded. The explanation most researchers support is that the Queen's chamber shafts were religious architecture. Model passages, built for the king's spirit rather than his body, aimed at the stars his soul was meant to join. Orion for rebirth, the imperishable stars for eternity. The doors, in that reading, are ritual gateways. Thresholds a spirit could pass but a body never would. The copper loops may be symbolic handles for a soul. The red number may be nothing more than a mason's tally, sealed by chance. But here is the thing. Even the grounded explanation is extraordinary. It means the builders of the Great Pyramid drove precision channels through a man-made mountain, aimed them at specific points in the sky, decorated surfaces they knew would never be seen, and sealed all of it so well that 4,500 years later, our most advanced robots can barely reach the end of them. The mystery is not that the pyramid is magic. The mystery is how human beings, with copper tools and rope, built something this deliberate, this precise, and this sealed. That is the real story. And it was about to get much bigger. Because everything so far, the robots, the doors, the copper, the red number, all of it happened inside tunnels we already knew existed. The next discovery came from empty space no one knew was there at all. And it was not found by a robot. It was found by particles falling out of the sky. In October of 2015, an international team launched a project called Scan Pyramids, led by Cairo University and a French Heritage Institute, with physicists from Japan and France. Their approach was radical. They would look through the pyramid without touching it, using a technology borrowed from particle physics called muon tomography. Here is what that means in plain terms. Every second, particles called muons rain down on the Earth, created when cosmic rays from deep space slam into the upper atmosphere. Muons pass through solid matter, but dense stone absorbs more of them, and empty space absorbs fewer. Place detectors inside and around the pyramid count the muons arriving from every direction over weeks and months, and you can map where the stone is solid and where it is hollow. It is an X-ray of the pyramid, and the light source is the sky itself. The team placed detectors in the Queen's chamber and outside the monument, and they waited. To make sure they were not chasing a ghost in the data, they used 3 completely different detector technologies, run by 3 separate groups, each working blind to the others. Nuclear emulsion films from Nagoya University, scintillator hodoscopes from the KKK Institute in Japan, gas detectors from the French Atomic Energy Commission. If all 3 saw the same hollow shape from different angles, it was real. And slowly, a shape emerged, a region where far too many muons were getting through, a place where the stone simply was not there. All 3 teams saw it, the same void from every direction. In November 2017, the results were published in the journal Nature, one of the most respected scientific publications on Earth. Above the Grand Gallery, buried in the core of the Great Pyramid, sealed off from every known passage and chamber, there is a void at least 30 meters long, roughly 100 feet, a hollow space with a cross-section comparable to the Grand Gallery itself, one of the largest spaces in the entire monument, hanging in the stone above it, with no known way in. They named it the Big Void. It was the first major internal structure discovered in the Great Pyramid since the 19th century. And then something telling happened. Within a day of the announcement, Egypt's antiquities authorities publicly criticized the team. The Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities called the announcement hasty, said the researchers should never have gone to the media, and an unnamed official even suggested the team might be barred from continuing their work in Egypt. The biggest discovery inside the pyramid in over a century, confirmed by 3 independent physics teams and published in Nature, and the official response was not celebration, it was damage control. The findings were real. The physics was solid. But the people who control access to the pyramid wanted the story managed, not told. To this day, no one has entered the Big Void. There are proposals, including a tiny inflatable robot blimp designed to squeeze through a drilled hole smaller than a coin and fly inside the space. It has never been deployed. The void sits exactly where it has sat for 4,500 years. Detected, confirmed, and untouched. But the muons were not finished. The same scans picked up a second anomaly, and this one we have actually seen with our own eyes. Behind the north face of the pyramid, hidden directly behind a strange chevron arrangement of massive stones that scholars had puzzled over for generations, the detectors revealed another empty space. In March of 2023, the team published the details in Nature Communications. A corridor about 9 meters long, roughly 2 meters wide, and 2 meters tall, with a peaked ceiling. And this time, they did not stop at data. The team fed a tiny endoscope camera through a gap between the ancient stones, and for the first time, a human eye looked into a space inside the Great Pyramid that no one knew existed. The footage shows a clean, empty corridor with a vaulted ceiling, beautifully built, leading nowhere anyone can explain. It does not connect to any known passage. Its purpose is unknown. Some researchers think it relieves weight above the original entrance. Others think it points to something deeper, still hidden. And that brings us to right now. Because in late 2025 and into 2026, Egypt's most famous archaeologist, Zahi Hawass, who now works as a scientific advisor to the Scanning Project, began making public statements that turned this from history into breaking news. He has described a sealed corridor inside the pyramid, ending at a door that has never been opened, spoken about hidden spaces that may connect to a deeper chamber, and said that remote-operated robots will be used to explore where humans cannot go, with a full revelation promised for 2026. The scanning teams have already moved on to the other pyramids at Giza, and in 2025 they announced new anomalies behind the eastern face of the Pyramid of Menkore, possibly a hidden entrance. 33 years after a shoebox-sized robot first climbed into an 8-inch shaft, the machines are still going in, and the pyramid is still not finished talking. So lay the evidence side by side, because the pattern is what unsettles you. A sealed limestone door 200 feet inside a shaft that leads nowhere, with a twin on the opposite side of the chamber, a second door hidden behind the first. Copper fittings looped and finished on a face meant never to be seen. A builder's number painted onto a floor and sealed in darkness for millennia. Relics older than the pyramid itself, left inside the walls. A 100-foot void floating in the core with no entrance. A hidden corridor behind the north face, photographed for the first time in 2023, leading nowhere. Every one of these was concealed on purpose. Every one was meant to stay concealed. And it took robots, drills, fiber optics, and particles from outer space to drag them into the light, one at a time, across 3 decades. If the boldest reading is true, if even one of these sealed spaces holds what the builder's own texts hint at, the lost burial equipment of Khufu, an intact chamber, records from the very beginning of civilization, then the most studied building on Earth has been hiding its real secret in plain sight for 4,500 years, and everything written about it is a preface. And even if the careful reading is right, and these are ritual gateways and structural voids, then we are left with something almost as strange. A civilization at the dawn of history that engineered hidden architecture so precise and sealed it so completely that humanity needed particle physics just to find out it was there. Either way, one question hangs over all of it. The builders left doors. Doors have a purpose. What did they believe was going to pass through them? The doors are still sealed. The big void still hangs silent in the stone above the Grand Gallery, mapped by cosmic rays and entered by no one. The copper loops still curl in the darkness, polished for eyes that never came. And 200 feet inside a shaft aimed at the stars, behind 2 slabs of white limestone, a 4,500-year-old question is still waiting. The robots reached it. They pressed their cameras against the stone, and then they turned back. If you want to see what else has been pulled out of the dark inside the world's most ancient sites, the next investigation is on screen right now. Watch it, because the deeper you look, the less finished this story becomes.